Okay, welcome to the afternoon session. My name is Alastair Creelman. I work at Linnaeus University down in Kalmar in the southeast of Sweden. And it's my pleasure to host a little bit of a chat show here with our keynote speakers from this morning, Dave Cormier and Helen Keegan. And since you've already got access to the recorded session from this morning, we won't spend too much time on introductions. What we are going to do for the next sort of 45 minutes is talk a bit about some of the issues that came up this morning, maybe get a bit of audience participation if you can think of questions you'd like to ask. What I'd like to start off with really is thinking about how we're seeing in education the fact that we have different types of motivation in students and in children and so on. We have the internal motivation when we really want to learn for the sake of learning. And I often come up with our hobbies are fantastic examples of that. We're willing to spend hours, days, weeks of our life without any rewards whatsoever to devote to keeping a hobby going, keeping a club going. Mm-hmm. I often think of, I'm a bit of a bird watcher. I mean, bird watchers invest years of their lives for no apparent reward to something that they are extremely passionate about.
For whatever reason.
Yeah, whatever reason. And in school, how do we get... The key is to go from the external motivation in school, where we have the main carrot we've got is pass those exams, get that bit of paper. That's the only thing we're really offering. And how do we get that passion that we have in our free time to move into what we do in school? And both of you touched on that in your talks, very much so, Helen. And maybe I'd like you to start, really. How do we get internal motivation in the school situation?
Well, I think for a start, to use an oft-quoted phrase, being learner-centered is kind of key here. So rather than operating from the standpoint of an externalized curriculum, which is then kind of forced upon our learners, really thinking about our learners, what interests them, their perspectives on the world, learning about them, we can then kind of tailor the curriculum, or at least make it a curriculum which reflects their interests, their desires. So essentially you're dealing with all the same topics, but you're just not coming at it from your standpoint, you're coming at it from their standpoint. So I think that's really important, that kind of shift there. So personal meaning, I'd say, is key here.
So taking those hobbies and then getting them into the classroom, mm-hmm. and then building the curriculum around those hobbies, which is something that the net gives allowance for.
Yeah, absolutely.
Dave?
I think there are two things that I would say to that. One, I think when we're trying to find internal motivation, the thing we don't want to do is focus too much on the content. Internal motivation can be curiosity, it can be excitement, it can be fun, it can be tasty, whatever it happens to be. And you can actually pull people through any different kind of content by just sort of focusing rather on the methods of doing things, the way we go about things, and getting to any kind of content. So, I mean, your ARG's a really good example of that. Those guys all learned how to do videos. There wasn't necessarily part of their interest. Their interest was being part of this event that was going on, but they picked up literacies as they went along without actually focusing on them directly. They sort of naturally picked them up in the course of following another process that they're involved in. I think the other part of this, and this is the caution that I have around this particular question, is that you can't focus too much of educational change to the best of educators and the way that people react in the best of times. If we think of learning as one of those ways in which we develop literacies for the world, regardless of what part of that world we're talking about, a lot of the time we do end up having to learn things that we're only partially interested in. A lot of the things we do have to adapt to those other kinds of situations. So I think having a mixture of those things, the real passionate stuff, and also, and I don't mean to sound back to basics here, but having that ability to apply rigor to situations as well that aren't necessarily, only about the things that you're really passionate about is also something I want to come out of the educational process as well. So I certainly don't want only that rigorous process, and I think our traditional education system seems to be punitive in that way, where you're training people just to read and react. But I'd like to see a mixture of both.
Yeah, because I mean, no matter how we try to make learning as fun as possible, and we try various media, various ways of getting more interest, creating more passion. At the same time, though, we've got to admit that learning can be painful.
Yeah, totally.
Learning is
like anything.
sweat and tears.
Yeah,
if you're going to learn a foreign language, you've got to
really good
work very hard.
Yeah.
You've got to get those verbs in your head. You've got to know those endings. And maybe there are different ways of approaching it, but in the end, you've got to get it automatic.
Yeah.
You don't, so that you don't think. You're playing a musical instrument. You've got to play those melodies, those chords without thinking, and then be able to put your passion into it. And that means hours and hours of very tedious rote learning.
Yeah.
And we have to be careful not to promise people that just by playing games or doing simulations that you can somehow automatically get that level of expertise.
Yeah, language learning is a really good example of that. I mean, it's true of anything. It's true of sports.
Yeah.
You know, if you want to be a professional hockey player, there are hundreds and thousands of hours of sitting in the basement shooting a puck at the wall.
Yeah.
And not every day is that going to be a fun process. So, I mean, we know these things about learning because they're part of our daily lives. I think, for me, the overall message is very much what's coming out of what you're saying, which is we know the answer to these questions already. When we look at learning about sports, or we look about learning about language, we look at learning about cooking, it doesn't matter what we do, we know that it's partially fun and passion, and we know that it's partially hard work, and we know that that combination is different for different people, that somehow, when we take that to an educational system, we go, all right then, let's bureaucratize that. Step one. And we do this completely artificial thing that has no relationship to the way we know the rest of the world works. And that to me is where I always sort of throw my hands up in the air and go, but you just agreed with me over here that this is how you learn to do everything else in your life. And somehow you want our school system to be something entirely different. Why is that?
Yeah.
And I guess that's my question.
I mean, I also think that it's important to actually have discussions about learning with learners. You know, rather than being educators that read a lot of books or write a lot of papers, or teachers that know how to do things and talk to their colleagues and say, I'll try this tomorrow, I'll try that tomorrow. And then all we do is go and do the curriculum with learners. It's like, no, we need to empower our learners through actually talking about learning with them. And then I think once you start to engage in those conversations, and then you can really explore ideas around things like rote learning and why it's still important in certain contexts. And I think once they understand different approaches to learning from different perspectives, then again, that's empowering for learners. So I think we do them a disservice by, it never ceases to amaze me, learners coming into a university that have honestly never thought about learning or why they learn. It's always just been focused on the subject.
Yeah.
And that to me seems crazy, especially when you're dealing with young adults. So those conversations tend to take place in education programs, but not beyond that. And I think we're really missing something there. And again, when we're opening up our learning/education processes and spaces through the social web, I think that we do need to be transparent in terms of those discussions with our learners. They have a stake in those too, decision making, whether it's the curriculum or the processes.
Yeah, involvement, empowerment, words like that come up all the time.
Yeah.
I mean, it's amazing how, again, with the nice Seth Godin quote was that if it's work, or if it's anything that seems like work, we spend most of our time trying to work out how to do less of it. And if it seems like art, then we spend all our time wanting to do more of it. And it's turning that around. And somehow in the school system and in the higher education system, we don't succeed in doing that. Because again, your average swimmer will, even if it's hell, will turn up at 6 o'clock in the morning every single morning and do those lengths, do those kilometers, backwards and forwards, backwards and forwards.
And I can't imagine that's fun every day.
No, it's hell. But I mean, they do it because they have that. The goal ahead is winning the medal, winning the championship.
Have that goal.
They've got that inside them.
Yeah.
And because if they can internalize the goal, then they can get, we all have amazing power if we can get that inside us.
Absolutely.
The trouble is in the school, we don't get that motivation inside us. It's outside all the time. We never get in.
Can I come back on that point for a second? One of the problems that I have with any of the game-based stuff and the game-based comparisons to learning, I think I'm contradicting what I said 5 minutes ago, but is that the problem with the comparing it to the athletes is that when you have a game, there are rules that are played and there are ways to win that game. One of the things about learning in a lot of the scenarios that we have is there are no winning. There's no way for me to decide that all of a sudden je parle parfaitement français. Like all of a sudden I'm a perfect French speaker. I don't get a gold medal for being a French speaker. And there's no way to actually measure success. And what we end up doing is trying to turn our schools into games so that we have scores and A's and B's and stuff. But we know, again, thinking about it rationally, that those aren't real things. Whereas the gold medals are things inside of our culture that understand. One of the things that happens to a lot of students that we talk to is that when they get, particularly succeed, like high goal students, is that when they leave the university structure to go out into the real world, whatever that is, and they become artists or business people or whatever, they soon recognize that those structures that provide easy goals for them don't exist anymore.
Yeah.
And suddenly they have to internalize. So I think the internalization is critical. I think the language around it maybe even more so.
Yeah, and it's quite interesting thinking about the kind of need for approval as well. So my mind's just going off on a tangent here, but thinking about sort of
grade me.
motivation and reward systems, that kind of drive. You know, and who are, learners are essentially performing to different people. They're motivated by feedback from different people. Certain types of students will be extremely motivated by high grades from a teacher, but other students are more motivated by feedback from their friends, like, God, that's an amazing painting, or I love the way you play that guitar. So we often think about it in terms of educators and learners, but there's a lot, there are a lot of influences in terms of any particular learner and their particular reward mechanisms, I think. So, and we're not always in control of those, but going back to my point, that's another reason why I do think it's important to kind of identify, the areas of passion for every learner. I think once we do that, we can take them to some powerful places.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier about that we stop grading people, but at the same time, that is the hard currency of learning. And in a way, the hard currency is it's a curse to learning because it puts all focus on the grade, on the certificate, which can actually disturb learning, because again the common thing in higher education is people want to pass. They want to know, what do we need to know to pass the test, and if it's not in the test, we don't want to know it. You give wonderful examples of where you can transcend that. And when you can internalize it, they will go that extra. They will find out about other things. But most students want to know what's in the test, give me that knowledge, and let me get my certificate with as little effort as I possibly can.
Totally.
Yeah, I mean, I think, we're all born with this innate sense of curiosity. We see it in small children. It's beautiful to see.
Yeah.
And then inevitably we kind of lose that sense of curiosity, partially because of going into a system where things are measured and categorized and ranked, and it's a risk-averse culture. The whole idea of assessment, grading, quality assurance is all about mitigation of risk.
Yeah.
But then there's also physiological reasons for losing our sense of curiosity, and we were talking about this last night, and there's going to be somebody here, I'm sure, that knows a lot more about this than I do, but I think between the ages of kind of 5 and 7 or 6 and 8, part of our frontal left lobe develops, and that's the part that kind of gives us a heightened sense of risk, and that's actually really important because it ensures our survival. Because if we carried on like little kids without realizing that if you jump off there or fall up, you will die. So, so there's also this kind of survival mechanism as well, I guess. So probably before schools, when we were just surviving, we kind of had no sense of risk of small children. You develop this sense of risk, and then you are literally surviving in the world. But obviously now we've got a whole host of different influences. But the fact is there are still physiological reasons for the loss of curiosity alongside the school system.
And in my classes, I just don't tell them what those are.
Yeah.
And my students get extraordinarily frustrated.
Yes.
In the second, every time I teach this one course called Educational Technology in the Adult Learner for the University of Prince Edward Island. And on the second day of that class, bar none, every time, I have something close to a riot where the students, and these guys are professional teachers, so it's especially galling to them that I won't give them clear objectives and I won't tell them what exactly I want from them. Because what we're trying to do is get them to the point where I'm working with professionals, so they have some sense, they know what goals are, they just don't associate their own goals with the learning process. So we go through that battle of saying, no, and they'll ask me, well, how do you want me to do that? I'm like, well, why don't you just try something and we'll see how it goes. And I'll say, look, I don't even care. I want it to make a reasonable effort. Like, I don't want you spending all night on this, but make a reasonable effort to the point where you're feeling comfortable about it. And then for the first part of this, I'll just grade you on having it done, as long as it's done well. And they'll go, well, what do you mean by well? I'm like, so that you're comfortable with it when the time you're finished with it. And then we go through this process. And by the 4th, 5th, 6th class, the participation rates go like this.
Yeah.
Right? At first, they're rigid, and some people never totally buy in. But my view of that is that in the other method, some people never buy in.
No.
So I'm fine with that. But what I'm doing is trying to give people a sense so that when they finish my class, they don't have a symbiotic relationship built with me. That somehow they only learn when I'm in the room. And they only learn when I'm judging their learning. I want them to leave the class and be able to go to deal, like I was saying this morning, to deal with uncertainty so that when they're confronted by something that's related to what we were doing, and they look at it and go, man, I got to decide about this. What am I going to do? They don't think, man, if Dave was here, he'd know what to do.
Yeah.
What they think is, wait, when we what did I do last time? And they have that experience of being challenged, of fighting through that process, whatever it is we're learning, so that when they're confronted with it next time, they have some tools for dealing with it on their own.
Yeah.
That is not always a popular approach. I do get a lot of feedback at first, but I would say 90%, 95% by the end of the class, students will come up and go, it's always like 3/4 of the way through. You'll see the light bulbs go on one after another, like, you're doing this on purpose. Maybe. And then they start to understand, and then they're able to take those things and model them back in their own classrooms. But anyway.
Yeah, I have exactly the same experiences and approach,
Yep.
I guess, with regards to assessment. So avoiding the mark matrix, avoiding the really strict criteria. And I'd say half of the learners are completely freaked by that.
Oh, yeah.
They just do not know what to do.
I had someone cry once.
Really?
Totally.
But as you say, the structure simultaneously constrains.
Yes.
And that is the issue. So if we take away that strict kind of matrix, the hierarchy, the assessment criteria, then they are free to flourish. And
Yep.
what's amazing is that half of the students will go way beyond what's expected. And as you say, the ones that don't do so well, the ones that struggle possibly wouldn't, would have been the same anyway.
Or
so.
they would have been different people that struggle. And for me,
Yeah.
Yep.
and this may sound silly, but the idea of constraining my students to the things that I know, given the way the world is, seems ridiculous. I mean, the vast capacity of my knowledge in my industry is whatever it is. But if you look at what's out there,
Yeah.
it's like this.
Yeah.
And I don't want them stuck here.
Yeah.
Right? I want them confronting me by the end of the course and going, yeah, but Helen says this. And I'll go, oh, yeah, that's a good point. That's an outcome that I'm looking for.
Absolutely.
Maybe
Yeah.
not you, but somebody else.
I think also that I see there's a lot of parts of education today we're seeing a development of two sides, two directions. On the one side, we have this the amazing creativity that's going on in net-based learning and using the net, using social media, what you two to represent, and so what many of us are already working with as well, with enormous possibilities for collaboration and actually all the educational goals that everybody shares. We all want collaboration, we all want independent learners and so on. But that's a sort of slightly anarchic embryo, or sort of amoeba that's forming in different directions all the time, against, on the other side, the traditional system, which still dominates most of our jobs, where even if we try to experiment in the fluffier side of education, we are stuck we've got to fill in the forms, we've got to report the grades, we've got to do according to this, this, and this. And we're very much restricted, and we see how governments all over the world are very much interested in things like PISA ratings, league tables. They're encouraging schools to compete against each other instead of collaborate. They want to see students getting the best grades. They are rewarding so-called successful schools and punishing unsuccessful schools. And we're getting a public political debate that's looking at education as a commodity. And this sort of paradox where you've got two totally different worlds are we seeing the beginning of a complete split? Or can the traditional structures be reformed and become more flexible? We've been trying for many years, but we see a bit of a backlash both here in Sweden and in many other countries. I think even in the UK and in Canada, you hear cries for more order in the classroom, more let's get the schools back to basics. Let's
turn off the phones.
Yeah, turn off the phones, stop all this messing around with the net and so on. Let's get back behind the bench and
reading, writing, and arithmetic.
Yes.
3 Rs.
That was a long question, but in a way, what's going to happen here? How do you see it?
Monologue, really.
I think that the whole kind of debate between the progressives and the traditionalists is, as we know, it's not a new thing. This has been going on for years and years and years. To me, to be honest with you, the thing that's changed is that we have the technologies to enable the progressives to kind of join forces. So that's the shift. So I don't think the argument's new, but just the affordances of the communication tools have kind of added weight to it. Where it goes, I do not know. I mean, I think, Dave's work, I mean, as kind of Mr. MOOC, I mean, Dave termed, came up with the term MOOC, and then it's been fascinating to see what's happened in that space. Something that was a completely kind of open, rhizomatic, connectivist approach to learning, now being commodified in these sort of huge partnerships. So I don't know what to think about. I'm seeing these just parallel strands, to be honest with you. There were so many fantastic kind of underground initiatives, things like Not School in the UK, Dale Stevens in the States, who is about 5 years old and has set up his... No, sorry, that's an exaggeration. But, there are all sorts of kind of counter movements. But for me personally, I just see things bubbling along in parallel, and we all just shout louder and we can hear one another more clearly because of the technologies. What do you think?
I think shouting louder is a good thing. I mean, I think what I'd like to say is that we're seeing the last gasp of that traditionalism. I think that right before something gets ripped out, it's going to put its foot down one last time. And at some point, we cannot both commit to trying to create a creative society and lock that society in a box. And it's not, you've got that cognitive dissonance in the traditionalist approach right now, which it can't maintain itself. At some point, the results and the lack thereof are going to become apparent. And then the people, that last gasp of people who are saying, but I want learning to be like it was when I was a child. Those people are eventually going to stop being in positions of power, and you're going to end up with the next generation looking back 25 years. And the problem is not 25 years ago, because 25 years ago, we had some really progressive education stuff going on, right? The problem is 40 years ago, we didn't. Or 50 years ago, we didn't. And actually, we did in some places, but not so much broad-based inside the education system. As the people who remember the 70s as their formative years become into positions of power, we're going to get an awful lot more, I think, of the next version of it. At least from a Canadian context and the way that you look at progressive education in the 1970s. So, I mean, it goes like this. I think Helen's totally right. We need to band together as much as we can, find that ability to make the pitch to different audiences, I think, to some degree. I've worked with the government in Prince Edward Island a little bit, in the province that I'm from. Education's a provincial controlled thing. These people are in control of the education system. And I'll tell you what, those ministers in my province, they care. Now, what they need is some kind of evidence that they can turn and hold up and go, this works like this. They can't simply go, crazy guy over there says that's going to work, so let's go ahead and do it, right? So what we need to do as much as anything, I think, is find ways to take the work that we're doing and translate it into language that people can say. So if I can walk in and say, look, this will be zero on your budget, right? It's not going to cost you more to do it this way. I can look at somebody else and go, look, we'll control the risk on this. These are the risks that are going to come out, but this is the worst case scenario. People are going to get paranoid because they're arguing. I don't know about that one. But I mean, we need to be able to put those arguments to the right kinds of people. And we need to be able to, as you said earlier, this discussion we had beforehand, we need to get access to that discussion. We need to be at the table. So we need to get people like you guys to get to the point where we're sitting down with those people and having we need to be at the table to go, oh yeah, no, that thing they said about this not working, really there's no research. Homework. There's no evidence in the whole world ever to say that homework is good, that it's helpful, that it's useful, that it helps kids learn. There's been 100 studies. None of them have ever proven that it works. And yet, here we are.
Yeah.
My 6-year-old is coming home with homework.
Yeah.
And I'm like, tell your teacher you won't do it.
It's also, I mean, very often we get the question, where's the evidence? Show us the research that shows that online learning and using the net. Let's see the evidence. At the same time, when you say, okay, where is the evidence that the classroom approach works?
Yeah, compared to what?
Yeah, compared to what? And I mean, that isn't there either.
No. Well, homework's the perfect example. There's no evidence. There's none. Have you ever seen any?
No, not at all. I mean, and I think a lot of the evidence that means a lot to me when it comes to education is largely, excuse the term, but anecdotal.
Yes,
it's telling stories about things that happened.
Yeah.
Powerful stories. Let's not underestimate the power of the story. Yeah. And today, after we finished our session and went for lunch, and I noticed that a few of my students had been tweeting. And they're absolutely buzzing because they're like, yay, Haluki's there and she's just been talking about my work. And that's amazing, to be connected like that. And I mean, I love my students and I love to feel that we are connected in these different spaces. They're in uni now. I'm doing my stuff here. And the power of that connection is something, it's amazing. I mean, I've been in HE for 14 years now, and it's only really in the last, I'd say 3 or 4 years because of Twitter and the mobile social web that those connections have really begun to happen. And I literally cannot imagine being an educator without being connected to my learners in that way. I wouldn't want to.
Yeah.
It's transformed everything. And so there you go, powerful story.
Yeah. I think all of us can agree with that. I mean, I know myself, I mean, my journey from discovering social media a few years ago, I mean, I wouldn't be sitting here, I wouldn't be doing half of the things I do every week had it not been for getting out online and being part of the conversation. So the fact the whole world opens up for you as an educator. Right. What I'd like to turn now to is that when you, listening to your great presentations this morning, especially Helen with the
it's way better.
Using gaming and so on, and alternate reality and so on. When I think of the people I work with regularly, colleagues and so on, what you're talking about is on another planet, let's say. They're not connected. They don't even know how. We also have a lot of students who don't even know that this world exists. Totally. They have no idea what's out there. They hear rumors, but they choose not to do it.
The myth of a digital native.
Yeah, and we've got this digital gap it's a chasm at times. And I see at my university, just as at many others, we have the whole scale. We have innovative educators who are doing wonderful, interesting things, are really pushing the limits. And at the other hand, we have basically people who are doing what was done 50 years ago. It's chalk and talk and copies from the copying machine. And that is just about, that's the level of it. And the whole range in between, how do we get them on board, given that they've had there's been 15 years of this going on. They've so far not got involved, chosen not to, or not had time. And now I can hear many people say, this has gone so far, I don't even know where to begin. Well, I've lost the place, and I'm ashamed of myself, but quite honestly, I cannot for the life of me see how I can catch up with the last 15 years of development. What do I do? How do I get started here?
Well, and that's from the pitch for me this morning. What we learned from years of running community-based teacher support systems is that after a while, you need to set an event and allow people to join it so they can be at the beginning of something. Yeah. And that's where the MOOC can be really helpful, right? Because there's an event, you just need to join, and then from there, as long as you have a support structure and there are people that are there with you, you can make that first leap in. What I do have to, the other part of that I'd like to respond to that is that, frankly speaking, they can choose or not choose. But I mean, when I look at the talks that I've done on social media this year, I've been talking to HR organizations, I've been talking to people, like I'm talking to core, not technology-connected industries where understanding social, take HR. Yeah. Right now, you can't be an HR professional and not understand how digital identity works. So you can't look for staff, recruit staff, support staff without knowing what Facebook is and how it works, without knowing how people perform their identity on Twitter, so that you can make judgments about people based on who they are and whether or not they fit into your company. And HR is not an exception. You can't be you won't be able to be a professional. And half of I'm going to talk to a restaurant association next week in Canada to talk to them about how their staff represent their organization and where those lines are and where the management shouldn't touch people's personal lives and how to make distinctions about that. So bar staff are going to have to understand that about the way that they use their social media. Yep. You can't escape it. Nope. So I don't care. There's no like special pass for teachers because they're busy. And you know what? I totally understand that they're busy, and I completely believe that teachers are in that like doctor area of overworked, at least in the Canadian doctor sense. But it doesn't matter. It's not a choice anymore. You know.
But you've got to have support for these teachers,
totally.
And you've got to have a leadership. You've got to have the leadership, the rectors and so on, have got to understand this and give the time, and that's not happening in many places.
But the irony is, it's like the thing that we're talking about in terms of the education system stifling curiosity. It's that kind of pressure that we put on things when we try and formalise them. So if you do have people that are really, you know, not comfortable in these online spaces, then pressurising them into joining the online spaces for educational purposes, I don't think is the way to go. But, you know, are they using Skype to talk to their grandchildren in another country? Are they sharing photos online through Facebook? A lot of the time people are actually already doing this stuff and making these connections. So it's about building the confidence up in those informal places and then getting them to kind of see how they can transfer that thinking into their own practice. So I do think that a lot of people are doing this stuff already. And, you know, and it's like, I mean, I always say to my learners with blogging, it's terrifying for them at first. But then you sort of saying, you're actually doing all of this stuff already. You're networking with people, you're commenting on the Facebook things, you're liking things, just like that with more words. So, you know, I think we just need to twist things around a bit, and it's about finding the magic moment for everybody has a magic moment when it clicks into place. I honestly believe that everybody has that. So it's just a case of finding that. I don't think that finding it through a kind of top-down imposed use of social technologies in the classroom is going to work for everybody.
And I think we've been our worst enemies in this. And to some degree, we talk about this crazy innovation thing that you need to join it. It's so cool. And then we show them fancy people flying in the air. I mean, that was the worst thing with Second Life with the flying in the air. and people just, they didn't understand how this affected their lives and what. If you look at the broad scope of literacies required to work in social media, 95% of them everybody has. And I don't even mean linking on Facebook. Knowing that other people are real people, knowing that interacting with them and being nice to people is more likely to give you a better result than being mean to them. These are things that people understand. And to be honest, 45-year-olds understand a lot more than 18-year-olds. I mean, most of my social media training stuff is with 45-year-old teachers on average. And what I find again and again, even for the last class that I taught, I hope you're watching, the last class that I taught, I had 5 people that when I put a URL on the board, I wrote http:// and then the address, they didn't know what to do with that. These are people who'd been teaching for 15, 20, 25 years and didn't know that there was a place in the browser where you could write that thing and it would take you someplace. So I mean, I'm not talking about students who are prepared for the content I was going to deliver them, but they managed to get from there to teaching a class on social media 6 weeks later because at some point I convinced most of them that they already had the literacies. They know how to stand up in front of people. They know that goals are important. They know that they need to do their work. They know those kinds of things, and those are the critical literacies. The stuff about signing in and logging on and stuff, you can pick those things up.
Yeah.
But I think we've oversold the complexity of the platform.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that I know totally that I used to do it. I used to show people fancy, crazy things and say, look, you know, I brought in this guy. We had a story that happened. I'm still babbling now.
No, go for it.
I had a story that I used to tell in these talks all the time, like the one this morning. We were in the middle of where I was trying to explain to the students how media has changed and the way that they're so incredibly focused on individual people, even big companies. We had this campaign. It was the Old Spice campaign. I don't know if it played over here.
Mine was big.
Okay. In the midst of that campaign, on one day, they did 160 videos responding to tweets that had been done by people who had watched the commercials. Well, one of those people that tweeted it was in, like, down the hall from me. So I brought that into the classroom and said, look at how focused this is. Look how small the world is. Kent is the guy's name from down the hall, had this video made by the Old Spice guy for his 14-year-old kid. You know, that's the world that we live in. And then a friend of mine retweeted that to the guy who designed the campaign, who tweeted me back and said, do you want me to come in and talk to your students about this tomorrow morning? So I did. And we showed it up, and the next morning that guy comes in, and we had a great chat about how media manipulates people's minds. And it was really good. The problem is that model is something I can do because I've been doing this for 10 years. And I have the experience and I have the network capacity to have these people pull this stuff together for me. Is it going to happen to you the first time like that? Probably not. You know, but you don't need to have the guy from Old Spice to come in. What you need is the teacher from the next school is going to do it. One of the best interviews we ever had. We had kids from Virginia and kids from New York City talking to each other on Skype. This is 6 years ago. And we were broadcasting between them, and we had to do all kinds of crazy things to make it happen. But we were broadcasting that, and the kids had prepared their Halloween essays, and I think they were 11 or 12. And the guys from New York City went first, and they said, I'm so excited to go throw eggs at houses tonight, and we're going to grab all this toilet paper and put it in the trees. And the kids from Virginia were like, I'm going to my grandma's house, and we're going to have supper. Why would you throw eggs at houses? And they had this really, really good, really sort of eye-opening conversation between two people who are in the same country, but essentially live in an entirely different culture. And for those two groups of kids, it was changing. Like, you could tell in their writing afterward, for months later, that it had an impact on their lives, on their thinking, and, I might add, all those digital literacies that go along with that. But those stories are the ones we need to tell more often, because they're the ones that are within everyone's reach. And those kinds of moments, even though once we got a woman from Kuwait fired because the group we had them matched with in Argentina had posted their beach party photos on the Kuwaiti website, like the bikini photos on the Kuwaiti website. And we learn from those situations. We need to check out more of the cultural situations before we go ahead. But those kinds of things are completely possible online. Those are people who just ran into each other, set up a scenario. Skype Classrooms does this right now. You can go to follow Skype Classrooms on Twitter, and they make these connections between classrooms all over the world. Those are within everybody's reach.
Yeah, I think there is a fear, however, I hear from many people that they're scared. Are we allowed to do this? We've got to. They're scared that maybe there's a copyright issue here, or what's the school's policy? What's the college's policy on this? And of course, very often the school or college doesn't have a policy at all because they don't even know it exists.
Right.
So that they end up not doing any of this because they don't quite dare to stay. What happens if it goes wrong? So I know people who they're curious about the idea of Skype, but are we breaking some kind of law? Are we going, it's also interesting how when you talk about many of the social media we use, which indeed are incredibly simple, never been simpler, never been freer. And I get teachers who say that, oh, you know all this high-tech stuff, I'm not so good at that. And I say, well, what do you work with? And they are brilliant. They work every day with our finance system.
Absolutely.
Archaic, weird finance system.
And I mean, talk about technically complex.
Totally.
Or our university admission system. Talk about complex. If you can do that, my goodness, the voice threads.
I am having a nice day. Tweet.
It's. But somehow there's a selection going on here. It's like this sort of. It's a little bit like you choose to be incompetent tactically because you don't want to deal with the issue. It's a little bit like you can be brilliant with a computer in the house and with a DVD player and all these other things, but somehow the washing machine is a mystery. That's quite a common symptom, or the other way around. And I think there's a little bit of that involved, that you decide that that's not my area. There's something difficult, and it's trying to. I think the stories of connections, as you said, you mentioned, those sort of stories of serendipitous, just things that happened because I got involved. Are good. They're good. They're strong stories.
Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking. Then I was at a conference last week, and it was an internet research conference, and I was at a session on Twitter and fandom. People were talking about the intentional use of hashtags to kind of jump on a certain audience. And they actually used one of your guys as an example, Justin Bieber. But then this slide came up, and it was Jedward on this slide. And I just thought, live example. So I tweeted it and used the Jedward hashtag. And within a few minutes, Jedward were tweeting into this conference, right? This real kind of intense, sort of critical theory tinged presentation, wanting to know if they could have a copy of this paper because it sounded really interesting. And it's just like, but, and these are the kind of examples that they make us laugh, they appeal to some kind of quirkiness. So I think we're often very serious about the whole thing. And, there are just so many fantastic examples out there of the power of these kind of connections. And that's, I think that's really important. And again, I didn't mention that for God knows how many people that do resist these technologies and think they can't use them are active users of Amazon. Okay, the world's kind of biggest recommender system where people review, where critical information literacies are there, you're making decisions on whether or not to buy something. We're all doing these things all of the time, but we just don't acknowledge it because they're kind of seamless part of our existence. So I think once you get people, it's building up people's confidence, really, making them realise that they're actually doing this stuff anyway, if they are participating online at all.
My father's a lobster fisherman.
Right.
Last year, he went about buying a new motor for his boat. And he calls me up. This is the self-avowed, the same I don't do all that stuff. And he goes, well, I was on the discussion forums, and it seems that... and then he goes, yeah, and I checked the Amazon, but, there's only really one vote there, and the guy looked kind of angry, so I don't really trust his opinion of it. And I'm like, man, you've totally got this nailed.
Exactly.
You have all the literacies you need to be able to do this stuff. And yet, he's a smart man, but he's a 68-year-old lobster fisherman from northern New Brunswick. And he's picked this up because he really needs a new motor, and he doesn't want a bad one. And I mean, that's the other sort of gateway. One of them is kids, and grandparents and kids, you can always drive that one home. But as long as you can find, one of my obsessions is coffee roasting. I roast my own coffee in the house, and I have a roaster, and I have a community that we talk on and stuff. If you can find that one thing for people, and I do that actually in this class this year, my first activity was go find a discussion forum or something that you love. And then come back and tell me something that you learned from them that you didn't know before about this thing you love. And they're like, what? I'm like, well, just go to the Googles. I'll be back in 10 minutes, and I walk out the door. And I come back in 10 minutes, and they're like, what? How are we supposed to do that? So we try again, and then the second time they're like, so just put the thing I like into Google? Like, yeah, just put the thing you like into Google, and then put the word forum at the end. And they do it, and they're like, and then like 10 minutes later, I'm dragging people off their computers. I'm like, get out of there. We got to get back to class. Because they were like, well, all these people out here are like me. Like, yeah, well, that's just it. Because there are people out there like you. And if you can find them in your profession, the same way you just found them about obscure, solar-powered race cars, then,
Yeah, absolutely.
But it's about getting out, getting involved, and encouraging people to get out there. And once they've got out, then they make connections. One of the big issues here, I'm working a lot with open educational resources, or trying to encourage the use of them in Sweden. And I mean, a lot of teachers are worried about putting their work out in the open. They're also worried about encouraging students to put stuff out in the open. And it's strange to me how there's a reluctance to get involved in OER still in many countries because of this fear of openness. An interesting paradox that in university world, research, the research is based on peer review. It's clear that is what research is about. Your peers going in, criticizing, challenging, testing, and asking you to justify yourself again and again and again. As part of the research process, that is a given. curious that we do not apply the same rules at all to the other side of our job, and that is teaching. In teaching, we can lock it all away. No one's ever allowed to look at what we're teaching, how we're teaching it, and the materials we use, they're all a secret. And it's interesting that the traditional university system that believes so much in peer review here does not believe in peer review, which means that if we put our teaching materials open on the net, that means it will be peer reviewed. The rubbish will be criticized. Someone's going to go in and say, you can't use that resource, you haven't got the rights to, or I don't agree with this. We're not moving that into we're not moving it into the daylight. And I wonder why we're not crossing that boundary, and we're being incredibly inconsistent on traditional values.
It's big business, first of all. I mean,
Big
multi-billion-dollar industry.
Sure is.
So immediately there are gatekeepers there and people with a vested interest.
They're probably here, actually.
Yeah.
But people
saying.
with a vested interest in keeping those kind of power structures in place. And I think that goes for everything. It's the same thing with the media and creativity. And I always think back to this example of, the idea of creativity that's become, it became commodified by mass media.
Yeah.
And John Gauntlet writes brilliantly about this, and thinking back to the Victorian social critics like Ruskin and Adams. It's really interesting reading their thoughts on creativity way back when. And, looking at creativity as a human right and a human need almost.
Yeah.
And so we're kind of taught not to share things. I think that's the thing, we're kind of conditioned not to share, which seems quite strange. We're in this world where knowledge is commodified, it's owned.
And exclusive.
It's exclusive, and it's sold back to us. So absolutely, there's a lot to fight against because there's some really powerful people, to have the battles with, basically.
And I've also worked on OER projects. The first response we get from a lot of teachers is, how much am I getting paid for this?
Yeah.
Because there's an expectation that any work that they would do, that they own the content, even though in a lot of cases it's stolen content in the first place. But so there's that sort of struggle in restructuring that. I think the other thing is people have this mystical belief that textbooks are somehow built in a wonderful way. And I think what I would love to do is somehow expose the textbook making process to the world and have them go, you're telling me they build them like that? Yeah, because the only attachment people have to them is that they're published, and they assume that there's some vetting process behind it. They don't know what that process is, because there isn't one. But, normal textbook making, as I've ever seen it, the ones that I've been party to, my colleagues who have been party to it, somebody goes and gets a whole bunch of people to write a bunch of different stuff. You find a famous person who put their name on the front of it, maybe write a foreword, and then somebody goes through and copy edits it.
Yep.
Like, really, that's how textbooks get made. How that can somehow be worse or better than having an open process where everybody gets to contribute and it gets to be vetted by lots of people who care about it, I don't understand. But I think to some degree it's a misunderstanding of how much work does or doesn't go in to the print textbook making. Because there's not much. And I'm sure there are beautiful textbooks out there that have been peer reviewed by thousands and thousands of people, but there are lots that are not. And I've been part of that process and don't do that anymore because I was astonished. Stuff would go in and you get paid whatever and you're like, what did you do with that? By the time it came out the other end, when it sort of got chomped through the machinery.
Yeah. I mean, we have so much material out there that we don't need to be producing too much more.
No.
Yet it's interesting as we go out in the exhibition hall here. I mean, you are struck by the fact that it's 90% textbooks.
Some of them are really shiny.
Yeah, and I mean, we have the ability to make our own and so on. Maybe we're not saying they're going to disappear, but the new models are beginning to emerge. But I think the biggest question is that our traditional structures, it's very difficult for us to give up them. Totally. It's difficult to imagine a world without a place called school. We can accept that learning might be able to take place much better in other surroundings, but that building, we can't imagine society existing without that building in the town called the school where the children go while mum and dad are working.
Yeah.
And if we've got that, that's part of society, and it's going to be we're not going to get rid of that, but that school has got all sorts of traditions and structures that have been part of our lives, are part of our way of thinking. It's very difficult to think beyond it. And so it is, we continue with textbooks, with classroom teaching, because it's what we know, what we feel comfortable with.
Yeah. I mean, and that's true for all of us. And I think the only conversation we can have there is to be honest about our own sort of ways in which we're like that, and to help people have that conversation themselves. I'm not even as interested to change people's minds, but get them to understand how they are sort of attached to their historical things. So I traveled 19 hours to get here, 3 planes, waiting rooms, whatever. I traveled with a laptop, a tablet, and a 550-page paper book. It's true. And it's huge. It's uncomfortable. It's awkward to get into my bag. And I found myself taking the notebook, the tablet out, which very well could have held that book inside of it, and putting it down, and then pulling out my book from out underneath anything, because I'm attached to it somehow. Yeah. The idea of having I have thousands of books in my house. Why do I keep buying them? I'm not sure, really. I mean, I totally understand that connection, right? Because I grew up with it. There's this, I mean, taking the book out of the middle of Western culture is in some ways like ripping the heart out of it for a lot of people. So I totally understand that. For me, important to make a distinction in this case between the novel and the long length, deep thought, very sort of profound, long piece, and a textbook, which is just a way of chopping bits of knowledge together and shoving them into a portable method. And that thing, we don't need it anymore because we have that. The long thought, I mean, I don't want to lose that either. And I think it's important for us to have these discussions, to talk about the things in our culture we're attached to, and make good decisions about the pieces we burn and the pieces that we sort of clutch nicely to our hearts.
And sniff, more importantly.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Paper.
Books.
Yeah.
Do you see, we're beginning to wrap up now, we see a divergence in education today, where we're seeing a sort of disaggregation. We're beginning to see some universities are producing a pile of content and running the content-based MOOCs. We've got other traditional universities doing their campus university courses, as they always have done. We've got the more anarchic...
Why is he looking at me?
It's your fault, Dave.
the open courses, the open MOOCs, the connectivist MOOCs, the peer-to-peer university, all these other sort of... And at the same time, we're now getting institutions are coming in who are saying, come with whatever you get from all that, come to us, and we'll give you a certificate.
Western Governors University.
Yeah, we'll give you credentials for this.
Yeah.
If you pay us the money, and if you maybe have to give us some extra evidence.
Yep. Flowering, essentially.
Yeah. Are we seeing a breakup of the structure, or could we see? Are we seeing sort of in a way that the traditional universities will continue doing exactly what they've always done in the way they've always done it, and possibly fading away, whilst maybe private institutions other consortia take education in a different direction? Will there be a split up, or can you see the traditionalists and the progressivists getting together? I mean, is it going to split?
Well, I think if you're talking about elite education, so I'm thinking specifically from a UK perspective, so the Oxfords, the Cambridges, I don't think they're under any kind of threat anytime soon. But as far as the rest of us go, I think already we're remodelling ourselves. You know, I mean, I know at my institution now, where live briefs are a core part of our model. So we're really trying, all of us are trying to move away from assessment as set by the lecturer to something that is kind of engaged with the world around them, and hopefully for the public good in some way. Although there's always this sort of neoliberal kind of undercurrent there as well when you start, you know, moving towards these spaces. But I think we're undergoing shift at the moment. And it seems to be largely positive, but it does involve sort of breaking down the walls and the silos in terms of knowledge, what knowledge is, disciplines themselves, and the role of the institution and how that relates to the society around it, to the community, I guess.
Okay.
I mean, to me, this shift has always been happening. We used to have a place where, in the 19th century, where people came out to work with famous experty people so they could adopt with those famous experty people and learn what they could from the few people who had access to the knowledge. And then all of a sudden, for some crazy reason, we decided to break that into courses and map that out so anybody could teach them as long as they had this credential over here. And then we built a school system based on that. And then that split up into two, where the Harvards and the Oxfords and that stuff remained the elite place that they were. And then we had this underclass of other people, particularly speaking to the American context, where if you had a degree from them, you could pretty much do whatever you wanted, but if you had one of those other degrees, it didn't quite count as much. Certainly true, for instance, in the Korean context, where I spent a lot of time 10, 12 years ago. So to me, that kind of reshifting and remaking is in constant flux. Right now, that model of, oh, I have a university and it looks like it did 80 years ago, not going to work. Small universities, I think, have the best chance in this because you have a connection between real people and students, and there's a chance, not that I'm biased from working for a small university, but I think the bigger universities are the ones that are really under threat here. Because if your model is the brand of university and you're trying to charge people thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars, and all you're doing is taking this bit of content and going, you want this? Do you want this? You can have it. You can have it. Give me some money. If that's your model, it's not going to work. So that's definitely going to shift. Because as of yesterday, you can pay $100 to whatever that university is in the States, and you can get that. And nobody's going to be able to compete with that price tag. So it's going to shift all over the place, I think.
Okay, I think we have to wrap up now. And so thank you very much,
Cheers.
Helen,
Thank you.
Dave.
Thanks.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And I must say that we have around 100 views right now.
Oh, wow.
About.
Hi.
So that's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, and that's the point, really.
Yeah.
Giving away, sharing all
Yeah.
this stuff, all your thoughts. So a big thank you.
And the recording will be available very soon.